infectious diseases, research, medicine, health. Welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. And now, broadcasting from the Outbreak News Skylar Studios in beautiful West Central Florida, here is your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, hey everybody, this is Robert, and welcome to Outbreak News Interviews. Now, when you hear the name Robert Koch, you think medical bacteriology and a plethora of amazing contributions. Well, joining me today to discuss the life and accomplishments of Robert Koch is E.B. Fred Professor of Natural Sciences Emeritus at the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and author of the very good book, Robert Koch, A Life in Medicine and Bacteriology, is Thomas Brock, Ph.D. Dr. Brock, welcome to the show, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to say in advance, it's an honor to talk to a great microbiologist about the titan of microbiology, Robert Koch. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your taking an interest.
Yes, sir. Okay, so before we get into a few of the many contributions of Robert Koch, can you tell us briefly about his years prior to bacteriology and microbiology?
Yeah, he was born in Klausthal, which is a small mining town in Lower Saxony, Germany. His father was the head of the mine, and so Robert grew up relatively wealthy family, but he loved nature, and he had an uncle who was a early photographer, and those are the days when photography was really difficult because you had to make your own plates. And so he would go in the field and collect wild animals and plants with his uncle, and then they would take photographs. He was educated at the German gymnasium as a teen, and then he went to the University of Göttingen, which is one of the most famous universities in Europe, in Germany at least, where he studied natural history, and he wanted to study that, but realized that he couldn't make a living doing that. And so after his natural history undergraduate, he went into medicine and became a medical doctor. He worked as a country doctor for several years after graduating and was involved as a medical doctor in the Franco-German War of 1872, and but after that he acquired a position as a district medical officer in the city of Volstein, which is a German-speaking city, but it was in rural Poland. As a medical officer, he was in charge of the public health of the area and had to take care of not only the people of the area, but also the animals. At that time, there was an outbreak of anthrax, which was a deadly disease of cattle and other animals. And since little was known about the disease, Robert Koch started to do research on it. He had bought a microscope so he could study microbes, and he did a careful study of the disease of animals, and he introduced the white mouse as an experimental model, and he was able to transfer the bacteria from cattle to the mouse where they were very quickly killed by the infection. But this gave him a model system where he could study the bacteria carefully. After some months of work, he discovered that the anthrax bacteria form spores, which are heat-resistant structures. And he was the first to prove the infectious disease theory, and it was based on his work on anthrax. Among other things, he discovered the life cycle of anthrax in cattle and proved that the spores would remain alive in the soil where the cattle could get infected, which is obviously a very important discovery in terms of control of the disease.
Now, during that time, there was a great number of scientists that contributed significantly to the field of microbiology and infectious diseases. However, if you put all the names up, the two that stick out above the rest is Robert Koch, our topic today, and Louis Pasteur. Dr. Brock, was there a professional, collegial relationship between the two, or was it competitive and contentious?
Well, Pasteur was considerably older than Koch and was much better known, but because Pasteur was French and Koch was German, and at that time especially, the French and Germans were not very interested in talking to each other. There was I would say more of a competition than any collegial relationship. Throughout most of Koch's career, his relationship with Pasteur was very poor, and they competed directly during the work on the causal organism of cholera, which was a major disease at that time through Europe and Asia, and the French and Germans both sent out expeditions to try to determine the cause of cholera. And Koch's party was the head of it. Pasteur was past the age of going in the field, but he sent one of his major assistants. It turned out that the French made a lot of mistakes and didn't really get any success in their studies on cholera, but Koch discovered the causal organism, which is called Vibrio cholera. Spent a lot of time in India, where it's a very serious disease, and was able to publish a very extensive monograph on cholera. Later on, it's kind of interesting, the French government actually hired Koch to come and study a cholera outbreak in Toulon, which really upset Pasteur quite a bit, but Koch's work there was very successful.
Okay, let's go ahead. We've talked a little bit about anthrax, and you talked a little bit about cholera. Let's look at some of Dr. Koch's a few of his other main contributions. And little can be done in a bacteriology lab without the plate technique, something we've been taking for granted for a very long time now. Can you discuss Koch's contribution to this?
Yes, well, he was interested in trying to culture organisms because that was part of the technique for proving the causal getting the right causal organism. And Koch had discovered that if you take potatoes and slice them, sterilizes them with heat and put them in a little chamber and inoculate them with material containing microbes, that you could get colonies of the microbe on the surface of the potato slice. And these colonies were very distinctive, and each sample had its own distinctive colony formation. And so he discovered from that the colony formation structure would be very helpful in studying the organism. But potatoes isn't really a very good medium for growing a lot of bacteria, especially pathogenic ones. And so he discovered a way of adding gelatin to a culture medium and then making a jelly surface where he could grow bacteria. And this worked pretty well, but unfortunately, gelatin melts at body temperature, so he wasn't able to culture a lot of organisms that way. But somebody in his laboratory who had spent some time in the Far East knew about the use of agar to make a gelatin surface. And so they introduced the agar polysaccharide, and that worked out very well because it remained semi-solid at body temperature. And so that was the introduction of the agar plate as a general technique. Then one of Koch's assistants, a man named Petrie, developed a little plate where you could make an agar surface, and you could go into the plate and pick out cultures or study them very easily. And so the Petrie plate was invented at that time and became the standard, which it still is to this day.
Mm-hmm. Now, his discovery of the agent of tuberculosis is arguably his most famous contribution. Would you agree with that assessment? And can you talk about the discovery that was made in 1882?
Well, there's no question that the discovery of the causal agent of tuberculosis was Koch's most important discovery, and it really made him famous. At that time, in the 1880s, tuberculosis was the most important disease, fatal disease in people, and so it was obviously extremely important to know what was the cause of tuberculosis. The bacterium is a slow-growing organism, and Koch showed great patience in isolating the organism. One of the things he developed was a method which is called the acid-fast staining method, which would permit observing the bacteria in animal tissues or in human tissues. And so he was able to determine the organism in the lungs or sometimes in the skin, and then transfer it to an experimental animal. And he used the experimental animal was a guinea pig, which I think he introduced the guinea pig as an experimental animal in medicine for medical research. So he was able to prove definitely that the bacterium that he was seeing was the causal organism of tuberculosis.
Now, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the famous postulates that bear his name. Dr. Brock, what are they and why are they important?
Well, they're important because they give you an approach for proving that a particular organism is the cause of a particular disease. And you start with microscopy. Koch was a dedicated microscopist and had started with his, when he was first doing his anthrax work, he used a microscope. So with a microscope, you can look at in diseased tissues and look for organisms. So the first postulate is the organism must be constantly present in diseased tissue whenever the disease is present. The second postulate is to isolate the organism in pure culture, which requires developing culture media and using techniques like the Petri plate. So the third postulate is to take a pure culture that you've been growing for many generations in the laboratory and re-inoculate it in an experimental animal and recreate the disease that was present. And then the fourth postulate would be to re-isolate the animal again, re-isolate the organism again from the second round of the experimental animals. And once those postulates were followed, the chances are very good that you have the causal agent.
Now, that's well over a century ago, quite a bit over a century ago. Have his postulates ever been improved on?
Well, not really. But it is important that you have to have an experimental animal. And there are a number of diseases, and human diseases even, where there is no experimental animal, that the only host, it would be the human. And so since we can't inoculate humans, that's a disadvantage. But I wouldn't say there's been any possibility of improving on them.
All right. Well, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Thomas Brock, for sharing your time and your expertise with me today. And please stay healthy during these times.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I'm pleased to be able to do this, and would point out that we're living in a time right now where we can't really complete Koch's postulates because the coronavirus is not really something that you can inoculate into healthy people. Anyway, thanks for asking me to talk.
Thank you, Dr. Brock. Have a great day, sir.